Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Presley Strother. I'm a CCDA staff member. Thank you for joining us today for our ADA Opportunities for Small Businesses webinar. The meeting will be recorded. The California Commission on Disability Access and the Pacific ADA Center are excited to have you here for part 1 of 3 in our 2024 Lunch and Learn collaborative webinar series. Today, our webinar will discuss the intersection of Title I and Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. For housekeeping, please remember to keep your audio muted during the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to post your questions. The chat feature is distracting for people with vision disabilities who use a screen reading software. For the Zoom viewing options, in your upper right-hand corner, select View for Speaker or Gallery, and that will help to view the main speaker or the gallery. With the screen share, you could do standard or side-by-side options. During the PowerPoint, the View option menu at the top of the screen, you can use to adjust the zoom ratio and any other features you may need. During the PowerPoint, you can use the slider between the shared screen and the participants to slide your screen to your preference. We do have captioning available today. I'd like to thank our captioner for being here. To turn on your captions, use the CC icon and it says Show Captions on the menu bar. You can change the size of the captions by selecting the up and down arrow next to the closed caption and do caption settings. If you want to move your captions, you can move the captions by hovering over and dragging them to the preferred location. You can turn off captions by selecting the CC icon and you can hide the captions on your menu bar. For our Q&A session, to ask a question, you can select Q&A on your bar. It is circled below. And once you do, a box will pop up like the one shown on your left, and you can input your question throughout the webinar. The Q&A session will be at the end of the presentation. We did have sign-up registration questions prior that we may answer as well, and we will get those questions answered. I would like to thank everyone once again for being here today, and I will pass it over to the CCDA Executive Director, April Dawson Rawlings.
Thank you, Presley. This is April. And for accessibility purposes, I'm going to start by describing myself. I am a white woman with short, dark brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a top that kind of has, it's a black top with some white chevron designs on it. And I'm sitting in a wheelchair, but I'm not sure that you can see that on Zoom, but I'm in a black tie-light wheelchair. And then behind me are some pictures of my nephews and a potted plant and a printer and some printer paper and a window. So let's go over our agenda for today. Now, first, Jan and I will be sharing a little bit about each of our organizations, CCDA and the Pacific ADA Center. And then we're going to move into some key concepts related to Title I of the ADA, which covers employment. And after that, we will discuss some key concepts related to Title III of the ADA, which covers places of public accommodations. And we'll get into what that means a little bit later. And then we're going to tie it all together and discuss service animals, which is a topic that crosses multiple titles of the ADA and is of keen interest to many business owners and people with disabilities. And finally, there was an opportunity for you to ask some questions during the registration process. And so we'll be able to get to those questions. And then as time allows, we'll be able to pull from the live Q&A. And to keep in mind that all of the questions that were submitted confidentially. So we won't be saying who asked the question. So it will be a general question for everyone's benefit, and no one will be called out for asking the question. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jan Garrett, who is the Deputy Director of Programs at the Pacific ADA Center. Jan? And you're muted, Jan.
There we go. Sorry about that. I muted because I took a phone call briefly. Okay, sorry about that. So I am Jan Garrett. I'm Deputy Director of ADA Programs for the Pacific ADA Center. I am a white woman with mostly gray hair. That's what you can see in front, wearing gray glasses and a red tropical print dress. And my background is just like a white background with the Pacific ADA Center logo in it. And I am a person with a significant disability. I was born without all my limbs and I use a power wheelchair for mobility. And so I do understand this information both personally and professionally. I've been doing ADA training and work for the last almost 30 years. So I'm happy to be here. So what the Pacific ADA Center does is we are part of the ADA National Network, and we serve Region 9, which is Arizona, California, Nevada, Hawaii, and the Pacific Basin. And we offer technical assistance by phone and by email, and that is informal guidance on the ADA and sometimes other disability rights laws that intersect with the ADA. We also offer trainings, and those sometimes occur remotely online and sometimes occur in person now that we're kind of through the worst of COVID. So we offer training, webinars, which this is an example of. And we offer webinars in collaboration with CCDA, but also we offer quarterly webinars on people's rights that have people with disabilities and their rights. And we've got 3 more of those coming up in 2024. And then we also every other month offer a healthcare in the ADA webinar. All of those webinars are free, and you can sign up, and you can see at the end, we'll have information on how to reach our website and sign up for our listserv, because we send out a lot of very important information, including all of our trainings and webinars that we host. We also can send you materials through links to the internet. And we have conferences every year, typically one virtual and one in-person conference. And our in-person conference is coming up in Sacramento on October 9th and 10th, and April will be presenting there as well. So we will continue our collaboration at our fall conference. So we encourage you to contact us, as our the final slides will show our contact information. And if you have further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. April?
Thank you, Jan. This is April. Let me tell you a little bit about what the California Commission on Disability Access is all about. So the California Commission on Disability Access, or CCDA for short, is a 17-member commission that was created by the state legislature in 2009. And the purpose was to convene a space where government, the legal community, people with disabilities, and business representatives could come together to brainstorm how to improve accessibility to businesses for people with disabilities while preserving people with disabilities civil rights and preventing costly litigation whenever possible. And it's important to note that CCDA is not an enforcement agency, but we're more of a resource hub. And some of the ways that we achieve our mission are through things like creating technical assistance documents, such as our accessible parking toolkit that just came out, and our one-page construction toolkit, which is also available on our website. We also do webinars and trainings, such as our 3-part series with Jan and the Pacific ADA Center, but we also do trainings that we could set up for individuals and groups. And we also will be planning future trainings and collaborations throughout the year as well with other groups, and also as standalone webinars and trainings that we produce as ourselves. We also do quite a bit of municipality and Chamber of Commerce outreach about funds that are available for access remediation, and also the importance of certified access specialists and how businesses can access those services. We also maintain a legal portal, and what that does is it tracks alleged construction and website related disability access claims, and we use the data from that portal to target our outreach and program efforts, and we report the data to the legislature every year. Every year we create a top 10 alleged disability access violation list, and that is used by business stakeholders, membership organizations, the legislature, and others to really think about, what are the trends happening in disability access litigation. And the theory behind that is that we can utilize that data to educate our stakeholders about what are some of the things to watch out for related to disability access. And organizations such as the California Business Properties Association and the Hotel and Lodging Association have shared with us that they use that data when they are doing manager trainings and other things for their members to learn about what to look out for. And as Jan mentioned, later on in the webinar, we'll be sharing a little bit more about how you can sign up for our newsletter also. We have a quarterly newsletter that we're really proud of. And we also have an event coming up in Orange County. It's an in-person event, which will be followed up later in the year by a webinar. But the in-person event is going to start with our full commission meeting. All of our commission meetings are quarterly and hybrid. And we are going to have in the morning, we're going to have a full commission meeting in Orange County at the Hilton Orange County Airport. And then that'll be followed up by an in-person listening forum, which will bring together business, government, and people with disabilities in the Orange County area to really brainstorm, what's going on in Orange County as far as access and how we can improve access together in that area. So, and that will be from 3 to 5, and you can learn more about that by signing up for our mailing list, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And now I'm going to send it back over to Jan to continue the presentation.
Great, thank you, April. So the ADA does have 5 titles, and we wanted to just briefly tell you what those are, although we will be focusing today, as April said earlier, on titles 1 and 3 of the ADA. So Title 1 is employment, and it applies to all areas of employment and all timing of employment, from when you would first want to learn about a job, say at a job fair, to application, to interview, to on the job, and the benefits and privileges of employment. So all the way through the employment life cycle. Title 2 applies to public entities, and Part A of Title 2 is state and local government. And so that means the state of California, that means cities and counties and joint powers associations and all the departments of those cities and counties within the state, in every state across the union. And then Part B of Title II is for public transportation. So that's public buses, light rail, paratransit, any of the public transportation that is offered throughout the country. Title III, which we will be talking about a little bit today more, is public accommodations. And that's basically for private businesses and private nonprofits open to the public. Title IV is telecommunications, and mostly deals with how people with hearing and speech disabilities can effectively use the phone system to be able to communicate with people on the other end who may not have a TTY, may not have a video phone, but also it covers things about the relay service and covers things about how people with hearing and speech disabilities can access the 911 system. And then finally, the miscellaneous Title V section of the ADA has a variety of different things in it, but that includes information about how you are not allowed to retaliate against anyone with a disability. April?
Thanks, Jan. And one of the ways that we're modeling accessibility today, in addition to describing ourselves in the beginning, is that we always kick off each slide by saying, this is April, or this is Jan, or go Jan, or go April. And that is so that people who are blind can track who's speaking. So that is one of the ways that if you're thinking about creating a presentation in the future, how you might want to model accessibility in your own organization. So let's talk a little bit about ADA Title I, which covers employment. As Jan mentioned, the ADA is a federal law, and it covers private employers with 15 or more employees within this specific title. It's important to note, however, that if you're a state or local government, it doesn't matter how many employees you have for Title I to apply to you. So it's not 15 or more employees for state or local governments. It's of any employee size. But if you're a private employer, it's the ADA Title I is 15 or more employees. Also, it covers organizations like unions, temp agencies, and also in California, there are several ways in which California law sometimes is a little bit stronger than different federal laws, just because of how strong, the advocacy has been here in the state. And so the Fair Employment and Housing Act covers 5 or more employees related to employment provisions. So it's important to keep in mind, think about where you fall and how many employees you have. And if you have any questions, if that's a little bit confusing, we're happy to clarify for you. Jan?
Okay, thank you, April. This is Jan. So under the ADA, an individual with a disability is defined as someone who either has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or has a record of such an impairment, meaning they have a history of that impairment, or they are regarded as having such an impairment. And we're going to go a little bit more into some of these terms in a moment. But basically, there's kind of three ways or three sections of the ADA definition of disability that you can qualify as a person with a disability to be covered by the ADA. April?
Thanks, Jan. It's really important to note, when we're talking about some of these terms like substantially limited and major life activity, one of the things we're not going to cover today, but is sort of intertwined in the conversation is, the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 really helped to clarify the law, because Congress's intent when they passed the ADA was really to provide the broadest coverage possible for people with disabilities. But what was happening before the ADA Amendments Act was passed is that a lot of the courts were analyzing the ADA in a really limited way and really focusing on, well, are they really substantially limited in this case and things like that. And so even though we don't have a slide about that, I just kind of wanted to call that out. So let's talk about what does substantially limited mean? And that's where you need to compare the person's ability to perform the major life activity with how most people in the general population perform the activity. So as an example, I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a person with a disability who uses a wheelchair. You could argue that the majority of the population walks, and I don't walk, which means that I use a wheelchair as a way to get around, which means that I have a major life activity limitation about walking, right? And also when you're trying to deep dive about what does substantially limited mean, it shouldn't require a lot of investigation. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but you should only ask for the documentation and investigate as much as you need to determine with the employee what the appropriate accommodation is. You're not supposed to be Sherlock Holmes here and violate privacy and things like that. You only need to know what you need to know to proceed with effectively accommodating that employee. Jan?
Thanks, April. This is Jan. So what does it mean to actually be qualified under the ADA, your skills, your experience, and your education? So a person with a disability has to meet the minimum qualifications for the job. And that can be the skills, experience, education, and some jobs actually require you to meet certain physical requirements or medical requirements or safety requirements. For example, police officers and firefighters have to meet certain physical and safety requirements. Also, people who are long distance truck drivers have to meet certain medical and safety requirements. And those are allowed, you are allowed to have those in those kinds of jobs and industries. But generally, you should make sure that you're accommodating people as much as possible and allowing them to have an opportunity to have a particular job. So making sure that your job qualifications are not, overly burdensome, and that they really reflect what the job would require, and that you can accommodate people for some of the essential job functions. Okay, next slide. April?
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about job qualifications and some of the pitfalls that companies get into, sometimes without meaning to. Job qualifications can sometimes, in the way that they're stated in the job announcement, screen out or tend to screen out people with disabilities, which is not allowed. Your job qualifications cannot do that. They also need to be job related and necessary for the business. It has to be related to business necessity. So don't throw just a bunch of stuff out there that you just think might be awesome. You have to really focus on what are the essential functions to do that job. And also the essential functions that you list have to be able to be performed with or without a reasonable accommodation. And I like to give the example about, an unintended consequence A lot of times for, let's say, an office job, let's just do that as an example. So I'll sometimes see employers say, must have a reliable vehicle to be able to perform this job. But when you really think about it, I have a lot of friends who are blind or low vision, who are wonderfully qualified people, but they don't have access to vehicles, but they're fully capable of figuring out how to get to a workplace on time. So a lot of times they'll read that and say, oh, I'm not going to be able to get this job, so I won't even try. And when in fact they might have a driver, or they may live right on the bus line and be able to get to work on time. So think about, in that case, do you really need, is it really essential to have a car, or should you change the wording to must have a reliable form of transportation to get to work, whatever that might be? And then you might broaden your pool and get a really great candidate that way. So just think about how some of your words either are unlawful or might actually create unintended consequences to screen out really qualified people. Jan?
Yes, April, that's so important. This is Jan speaking. So you may have to disclose your disability to your employer if it is not obvious or not apparent. Okay. So when a job applicant or an employee needs a reasonable accommodation and it's not apparent what their disability is, they must disclose their disability to the employer either verbally or in writing. And if no accommodation is necessary, no disclosure is necessary. You don't have to disclose a disability if you don't need an accommodation to be able to perform the job. And then employers can request additional information or documentation if the person's disability or the best accommodation is not obvious. And employers have to keep certain information about their disability or medical conditions confidential. So in other words, if somebody has information that they have given you about their disability or their medical condition, you have to actually keep that information locked up and separate from any employment information about them, because you shouldn't be evaluating people based on their disability or their medical information. You should be evaluating their work performance. So that all needs to be confidential. You shouldn't talk around the office about somebody's disability. That should all be on a need to know basis. So confidentiality is very important. Next, and April?
Thank you. So a lot of employers will think about, the concept of undue hardship. And some employers may interpret that to mean, okay, well, if I think that it's going to be really hard to accommodate someone, that means I don't have to do it. Nope, that's not true. Let's talk a little bit about what undue hardship actually means. And so the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees or applicants with disabilities who need them, except when such accommodations would cause an undue hardship. So that is actually a really high bar to prove. So if you are in a position as an employer that needs to pursue that, definitely, talk to your in-house counsel and keep a record of this. And make sure you're not misunderstanding what that means. And so it means a significant difficulty or expense, and it focuses on the specific employer's resources and situation. So it actually looks at like, what are the whole resources of the organization? What is the business? What does the business actually do? What is the business necessity? Why does that business exist? So you look at financial difficulty, but you also look at, is this accommodation going to be too complicated, large, or disruptive? You basically have to prove that this accommodation would either put you out of business financially, or would financially or would fundamentally alter the way that the business operates. And keep in mind that I am not an attorney, and neither is Jan, I believe. And so we're not giving legal advice. Be sure to talk to your, to an attorney or in-house counsel, but we are trained to give out this information. So just wanted to give that disclaimer out there. But just keep in mind that undue hardship doesn't mean that you don't feel like doing an accommodation. It's actually a really high bar to prove. Jan?
Yeah, excellent point, April. Thank you. This is Jan speaking. So what can an employer ask about an employee's or an applicant's disability? they cannot really ask about somebody's disability. You can ask how the applicant will do the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. So you can discuss, these are the job duties. How would you do this? Tell me how you would do it. And you can ask that, but you can't say, so tell me about your medical condition, or, tell me how many seizures you're going to have a day, or, something like that. You cannot ask about the person's disability or any medical information before there is a conditional job offer. And once there is a conditional job offer, you can gather more information, but again, you're not going to ask about somebody's entire medical history. That is not relevant, as April said earlier. What you really need to know is, how can somebody perform the job, and what information do you need to know how to accommodate them? Also, if an employee is already on the job and they're having trouble performing, and you think as an employer that you think you can help them in some way, talk to the person. Whether or not they have a disability, it would help if you talk to them if they seem to be struggling on the job, and try to help them through that, to offer them, some assistance, because it is a lot better to keep an employee who's been on the job and who's been trained and gone through all the paperwork and everything. It's so much better to keep that employee than have to let someone go and get someone new. That has actually cost you time and money. So try to talk to people, and you're required to, especially if somebody has a disability, to try to help them as much as possible, accommodate them, if they seem to be having difficulty. But again, don't ask them about their medical condition or disability. Just ask how you can help. April?
Thanks, Jan. This is April. Another important key concept for Title I is the interactive process. Now, it's important to note that the ADA actually does not require, but strongly recommends that you do an interactive process, but California law does require that you do an interactive process. And I always like to tell people that the interactive process is like a dance, and it takes place throughout the whole life of talking through an accommodation, and through the whole life of that employee being in your company and having this conversation. So the interactive process is really a chance for the employer and the employee to sit down and talk about what are the essential functions of the job, and how could that, what accommodations exist for that employee to be able to perform that. It's important to note also that just because an employee requests a specific accommodation doesn't mean that the employer has to provide that specific one. Part of the interactive process is there another acceptable accommodation? And let's talk this through. So it's important that both the employer and the employee engage in good faith in the interactive process, and that there's several different points where this could be triggered. This could be triggered by a disability disclosure. This could be triggered by, maybe someone is having performance issues, and then they say, you know what, actually, I'm having a really hard time seeing my computer screen. I think I might need, some large print here or some assistive devices here. That's just an example. The important thing to remember is that you need to follow up in writing. Make sure that, if you're a manager, what I always do as a hiring manager, as a manager, is I'll always say, per our conversation on May 30th at 12:28 p.m., thank you for talking to me. This is what we talked about. And if you're an employee, kind of do the same thing. Like, thank you for engaging with me in the interactive process. Here's what we talked about. Here's the accommodation we're going to try. And just make sure you're keeping it in writing so that everybody is held accountable, yourself and the employer, or if you're the employer, holding yourself accountable also. Jan?
Thanks, April. This is Jan. And remember that sometimes a new manager can come in, and so it's really important to have those accommodations in writing, because the new manager may say, I don't have to actually abide by that accommodation. I'm not going to allow it. So you want to be sure. That's another reason to have everything in writing. So here are 3 situations when accommodations may be required. You want to offer accommodations when you're helping an employee perform the functions of their job, and especially the essential functions of their job. Also, when you want to give a job applicant an equal employment opportunity in hiring or in the recruitment stage and making sure, like, for example, there's a sign language interpreter at the job fair, or that the interview room is at an accessible location, just to give some examples. So giving job applicants an equal employment opportunity, and then to prevent discrimination of employees with disabilities in terms of the conditions and privileges of employment. So making sure that, like, if you have, for example, a company picnic, and you're providing transportation to all the employees to get there, you want to make sure that transportation is accessible if you have any employees that use a wheelchair. And you want to be offering sign language interpreters for meetings and other important things for your employees who are deaf, who may use sign language. So those are what we mean by preventing discrimination in the terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. Again, those are just examples. April?
Thanks, Jan. So this slide talks about the ongoing nature of the accommodation duty. And just like life, change is essential to life. And when you think about, the whole life of a person who is working with you in your organization, change is the reason why accommodations often don't stay the same. And so it could be that you start off with an accommodation and a couple months later, you see that accommodation is either no longer needed or maybe it's not effective. Throughout the interactive process, you really want to, create touch points separate from the conversation about performance. You really want to be careful not to confuse those. And you want to have, specific sit downs with the employee about their accommodation and how that accommodation is going. You may need to adjust an existing accommodation, or you may need to provide an accommodation where one was not needed before because maybe someone's disability just arose, or like they have an injury, or maybe their disability is cyclical. And you also may need to stop an accommodation that was provided before, because once an accommodation is no longer effective, then that accommodation kind of ceases to really play a role in the process. Jan?
Thanks, April. This is Jan speaking. So what are qualities that are essential to the interactive process? We've kind of talked a little bit about what the interactive process is. So in the interactive process, employers should meet with the employee, request the necessary information about the limitations on their functions and what you would need to know in order to provide accommodations. Ask the employee or the applicant what they want. They may very well know of what accommodations will work for them. Now, they may not get everything they want because what they want may be an undue hardship. But if it's not, you should, as the employer, be providing it, and show that you're considering the employee's request and having that discussion with them. And then discuss available alternatives when a request is too difficult or too expensive and is therefore an undue hardship. Both parties should show good faith as part of this process, whether you're an employer, an employee, or an applicant. You should move the process forward in a really regular way. You should have direct communication, and again, whenever possible, keeping that in writing, at least through email. Exchange essential information. And avoid unnecessary delays. Don't put up barriers in the process. Try to make sure that it's all flowing smoothly. And that will actually make it go a lot better. April?
Thanks, Jan. Well, that concludes our section about Title I, which relates to employment. Now let's talk about ADA Title III, which is public accommodations. So what is the definition of a public accommodation? So that is a private businesses open to the public. It also covers things like if you're a nonprofit organization, a retail store, a restaurant, for example. These are just, hotels, motels. Those are just a few examples of places of public accommodation. Basically, if you're privately owned and you're involved in commerce, then you're probably a place of public accommodation. And Title III does not care how many employees you have. So it's places of public accommodation, regardless of how many employees you have, is ADA Title III's provision. Jan?
Yeah, so that could even be just an owner. If you're the owner of a business and you're the only employee, you still have to meet Title III requirements. So we just wanted to make that clear. So one of the things that a private business or private nonprofit that's a public accommodation has to meet is effective communication. So state and local government agencies have to meet this requirement as well. So you have to provide effective communication to people with communication related disabilities. And those communication related disabilities are hearing, vision, and or speech disabilities. And so what we mean by effective communication, there's lots of different examples, but you have to provide communication aids and services to people with one or more of these communication related disabilities. For example, if someone has a hearing disability and they know American Sign Language, you may have to provide American Sign Language, or like video remote interpreting. If you don't know that somebody's coming into your business or into your library, for example, you may want to have video remote interpreting on a tablet or on a laptop so that you can actually use that anytime anyone who's deaf comes in. You can also, if you're just having a very simple conversation with someone who is deaf, you may also just exchange written notes. You know, something like, how much is this candy bar? It's 95 cents. Inflation's probably made it more than that, but that can be just an exchange of written notes or written texts on a phone, something like that. And that's perfectly fine for a very brief, very simple conversation. But if it's going to be an actual training or a meeting or anything like that, you're going to need to be able to provide that sign language interpreter if that's what the person uses, or captioning if it's somebody who doesn't use American Sign Language. Also, for people with vision disabilities, you may need to provide documents in electronic format or in Braille or large print. So that's another example of a communication aid or service. And for people with speech disabilities, you're going to want to provide, you're going to want to have patience with them and allow them to finish their sentences, allow them to speak when they are trying to get the word out about what they need. So that's always important as part of effective communication. April?
Thanks, Jan. So now that we've talked a little bit about what effective communication is and some examples of how to accommodate people with hearing, speech, or visual disabilities, let's talk about accessibility for people with mobility disabilities. So it's really important to think about, when you're thinking about your business, it's really important to think about how would a person with a mobility disability access every aspect of your business, of your physical facility, your website, maybe not so much website because it's mobility disability, but you never know, right? Depends on a person's, how that mobility disability manifests itself. So think about how that person, like let's say you're a store that sells candy, how would that person, from the moment not even before they even walk in the door, but like from the parking lot all the way into the door, to the counter, to making the purchase, to needing to use the restroom, to grabbing the candy, sitting down and eating the candy. Think about the whole life of your business and how that might affect someone with a mobility disability. So some examples might be no step entrances with wide, easy open doors, accessible parking. I talked about how CCDA just came out with an accessible parking toolkit. Hint, hint, that'll be on our website this week. And we'll be distributing that at future webinars and events. So check that out. Now in California, as well as across the United States, there's something called door opening force. So across the United States, in places other than California, door opening force from the inside out has to be 5 pounds or less. The reason they don't have it going both ways in some states is because of weather. You don't want to have a feather light door, in Chicago when it's really blustery, for example. But in California, the door opening force has to be 5 pounds or less going both ways. And the ADA does not require a push button, but if you're able to provide a push button and can afford that or get some funding for that, like a grant, for example, then that would be really great, but it's not required, but the door opening force is. And so interior accessible passive travel, like I said before, how is that person going to use the restroom, go sit at the table, access whatever your business offers. And I'm just using a restaurant as an easy example. Now, one of my pet peeves when I go to a happy hour is a lot of times I keep seeing this where there's lowered portions of counters and bars. However, I see that as like a staging area for cups, or I see that as a place to put brochures, or I see it as a place to have your point of sale machine. That's actually a required place for someone like me who uses a wheelchair to pull up and have, happy hour, for example, just like everyone else. So just remember those lower portions of counters and bars, they are needed and they are used by people with mobility disabilities. Also thinking about accessible restrooms, one of the common things that I see is I see a lot of businesses will put like a really fancy potted plant right by the toilet, or they'll put in the entrance to the accessible restroom, or even in the hallway, they'll put high chairs, or they'll put like a really fancy, like a place to stock all their stuff to put it away so it looks less cluttered, like a shelf or something, but it might affect, the turn radius to be able to use the bathroom. The other thing you might want to think about too is make sure people can grab the privacy latch, that it's not too high up. Another example is, that those toilet paper dispensers, the grab bar should not be a holder for your dispenser. So sometimes I'll see that that the toilet paper dispenser is like sitting almost against the middle of a grab bar, and then that makes it really hard for me to be able to use that to safely use the bathroom. So just thinking about making sure your bathroom is accessible. And a key concept of the ADA is maintaining accessible features. Make sure that there's somebody in your business who is in charge of keeping track of your access improvements that are needed, and have a schedule for how you maintain your accessible features. Jan?
Thanks, April. So part of that maintenance of the accessible features is the path of travel. So you have a site arrival point, and that's usually like the sidewalk or the bus stop or parking. If you have it, you have all these site arrival points. So if you have parking, you have to have accessible parking, and that means at least one van accessible space. You may have to have more depending on how many total parking spaces you have in your lot. But the parking could be one of your points where you arrive at a site to be able to use a business or a nonprofit. You also need a clear path from the street or sidewalk or from the parking space itself. So the exterior area needs to have a clear path. And in California, that path is generally, if it's a sidewalk, it's going to be 48 inches wide. But otherwise, it's generally 36 inches wide, and it's 36 inches once you get inside the building into the public areas. You have to have a 36-inch wide accessible route throughout the building. April?
Thanks, Jan. This is April. So sometimes to accommodate a person with a disability, a business or government entity may have to provide reasonable modifications and adjust policies, practices, or procedures to ensure accessibility for individuals with disabilities. So let's talk a little bit about what that means in some examples. So a modification may be necessary for that person to be able to access the good or service that you provide. So one example of that would be when you adjust physical spaces like ramps, providing ramps or having accessible counters. That's an example of modifying your physical space. Another thing is, like, let's say you are a paint and sip. One of my favorite things to do is go to a paint and sip. And you may not allow outside food, but let's say there's someone with diabetes who needs to, eat a candy bar if they feel like their diabetes is acting up and their blood sugar is low. You could then modify the no outside food policy, because you obviously are just drinking wine. You might modify your no food policy to allow someone with that person with diabetes, that participant, to be able to bring in a candy bar, for example. Also, service animals. Many businesses, because of health and safety reasons, do not allow animals in their facilities. And so a modification to the no animal policy would be allowing service animals. And we'll be talking about that shortly. Jan, and here we go, service animals.
Here we go. What a great segue, April. Thank you very much. This is Jan speaking. So what are the basics of service animals? Service animals are dogs, and I'm going to talk about another animal in a minute, but basically service animals are dogs that are individually trained to do one or more physical tasks for their handlers. The dog has to do a physical task. The handler's disability does not have to be physical. It could be mental health, it could be emotional, it could be, hearing, vision, anything. So the dog must do a physical task specifically trained to do that to assist their handler. Emotional support is not a task. So emotional support animals are not service animals and are not allowed in public places that have a no pet policy. If you allow pets, you can allow emotional support animals as well, because they're essentially a pet. They're in the same category as a pet. But remember, the emotional support animals can be any animal as well. They aren't just dogs. So that's something that you definitely have to keep in mind. But emotional support is not a task. It has to be some sort of physical task that the dog does. It also has to be under control, which means it's housebroken, it's well behaved, and it is on a leash, tether, or strict, very strict voice control, so that it does not leave its handler's side. It is always with the handler, and it does not have accidents. You need to make sure that you're helping your animal do its business outside and not inside of a business or nonprofit. Now, as these pictures show, I have a picture of 3 service dogs on the left that are wearing vests, and we'll talk about in a minute why that's not really necessary. But also a service miniature horse is in a picture on the left, and you may allow miniature horses. They are in the regulations of ADA Title III. And we're talking like a large dog is what a miniature horse would be. And some people may use miniature horses instead of dogs because they're a little bit stronger and stable. They could be used to, lead a blind person. They could be used to help somebody who wants to get up off the floor, climb onto their back and get put into the wheelchair by a miniature horse. So there may be a variety of reasons that people want to use a miniature horse instead of a dog. So, but service animals, the only 2 that are allowed are dogs or miniature horses, and they have to do a task. April?
Thanks, Jan. So let's talk a little bit about what are the questions that you can ask as a business, as an employee of a business or an owner, related to service animals. This is one of the top questions that I get is, what am I allowed to ask? There are 2 questions that you can ask, only 2. The first one is the animal required because of a disability? Don't ask this if the disability is obvious, if a person is a wheelchair user or it's obvious they have a disability. Again, you only want the minimal amount of information you need to determine this. So you just want to ask, is the animal required because of a disability? And the person will say yes or no. And the second question you can ask is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? But you're not allowed to ask about the handler's disability or to see the task performed. If you ask for the dog to demonstrate its task, you're actually disrupting it from working, you're distracting it, and dogs may not perform it on command. It's not an appropriate thing to do because you're disrupting that handler dog relationship and being inappropriate. So is the animal required because of a disability, and what work or tasks has the animal been trained to perform? That's the only 2 questions you can ask, and those are really the only 2 questions you need to know. Jan?
Great. Thank you, April. So you don't require proof of training or proof that an animal is a service animal. You can train your own animal if you are a service animal handler, and that's because the organizations that train service animals are often very expensive and have long waiting lists. So the Department of Justice in the ADA regulations said people can train their own animals. And in California, service animals in training are actually allowed. That's a state by state issue. The ADA doesn't talk about service animals in training, but state laws may. And in California, you are allowed to bring a service animal in training, but you would need to have a tag on that from the animal control to say that it is a service animal in training. And it still needs to be under control and on a leash or tether. It may be, a puppy, so it may be kind of high spirited, but keep in mind that you have to allow service animals in training in California. And there is no requirement for a certificate, a vest, a special collar, any of that. None of that is worth the paper that it's printed on. And so don't go on the internet and buy those expensive certificates. They are literally not worth the paper that they're printed on. You can ask the 2 questions that April was talking about earlier, and that's how you determine if an animal is a service animal. That's the only way. April?
Thanks, Jan. And I know that many of us may have a hard stop at 1. If we do not get to your questions, because now we're at the question and answer session, we'll start with the questions that were asked in advance. And then if we do not get to your question, or if we see a question in the chat that may be more appropriately answered offline, maybe it's just requires more of a deep dive, we will get back to you, and we will share in a moment how to get a hold of us as well. So Presley, I will turn it over to you to ask Jan and I some questions, and Jan and I will tag team on the answers.
Thank you, April. This is Presley speaking. I'll start with the first question. How do the new updates to disability laws like Section 504 and the ADA change things for business and people with disabilities?
April?
I think that we'll probably need to tag team on this one, but
okay.
What's really great is you may have heard in the news that some new guidance has come out. For example, a lot of people talk about websites, and so we had kind of been waiting for the Department of Justice to give more guidance about websites, and so now a final rule was published for Title II entities that the WCAG 2.0 is the standard that should be used for websites. And then there's a couple of caveats to that we won't have time to cover today. But I know that the Pacific ADA Center's most recent newsletter talked about that. And if you send an email to Jan or I, we can talk about that as well. The other that just came out with some guidelines for doctors' offices and healthcare facilities on how to make sure that their equipment and services are accessible to people with disabilities. So I actually just attended a training last week about, making sure that, like if you're a private doctor's office, for example, that you have to have, mammography machines that are accessible for people in wheelchairs, and you have to have a certain amount of clear floor space and tables that can adjust for people to transfer and those kinds of things. So the government came out with information about that. Are there others, Jan, that I didn't mention? Those were the 2 big ones I saw.
Those are definitely the 2 big ones there. Almost every many federal agencies updated their Section 504 regulations this year, and 504 is from the Rehabilitation Act. So it's very similar to what Title II requires, but HUD, Housing and Urban Development, it updated its 504 regulations, and the one that you just mentioned about healthcare was updated with Health and Human Services. And yes, and there's also updates to the Affordable Care Act regulations as well. For information about healthcare. So the Pacific ADA Center has information on all of that if you want to ask us more questions about that. April or Presley, the next question.
Thank you. And the next question, this is Presley. Please discuss the need to have accommodation questions on meeting notices prior to online meetings and best access for meetings.
So that is really important. So I always share that one of the things that we always do here at CCDA is whenever we have a meeting or an event such as this webinar, we always want to have a notice that talks about how a person that needs an accommodation can request one, when a timely request what is considered a timely request for that accommodation, and a specific person that they can contact. It's really important. So for example, to access this webinar, if you need accommodations, please contact Phil McFall at this number within 7 days to ensure that appropriate resources are set aside, is usually the language that we use. Jan, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the requirements for certain entities, about making sure that they have that signage and that language?
Well, no, I think you did a good job of covering it. Make sure that if you're having an event or a webinar or anything like that, that you put language in there about who to contact for any kinds of accommodations or any kind of accessibility issues, anything like that. You want to make sure that that's really clear. Who do you contact? How do you contact them? All of those kinds of things. So that's important. Very important. I'll send it back to April.
Yeah, Presley, I think in the interest of time, we should share resources. And then if we can, I see you, Makai. We'll try to get to your question, but if not, you can reach out to us, and we'll make sure that when we send the slides out, we'll send any answers to any additional questions or how to ask an additional question. So here's some information about employment resources such as the EEOC, the ADA National Network. The Job Accommodation Network is really great if you're a hiring manager or an employee who wants to know some examples of how to accommodate a specific disability. Ask Jan is really great. Not to be confused with the wonderful Jan Garrett, but it's pretty cool that that's the same acronym. Yeah. Also learning about VOC rehabilitation. Disability Works California is the VOC rehab organization in California. It used to be called the Department of Rehab, but they rebranded. They can potentially help you if you're a person with a disability who needs training or employment resources to either not just get a job, but be retained in a job. And they may be able to pay for some accommodations. So if you're an employer who's wondering how to pay for some accommodations, if you hire someone who's a VOC rehab client, that they may be able to pay for some of those needed accommodations. Also, the California Civil Rights Office. Next slide, please. And here's some business resources. So you can access all of these resources through CCDA's website. They're to learn about certified access specialists, ADA tips, tax incentives, a little bit about everything we talked about today, effective communication, basic primer for businesses, service animal, frequently asked questions. You can find those on our business resources tab on our website. And to stay connected with CCDA, you can send us an email at ccda@dgs.ca.gov, or you could call our main line, which is 916-319-9974. Our website is www.dgs.ca.gov/ccda. And sign up for our newsletter and our upcoming events.
And then you can also stay connected with the Pacific ADA Center. We have that 800 number, 1-800-949-4232. You can email us at adapacific.org. And you can check out our website, which we've just recently redone to make it more plain language and hopefully easier to navigate for folks. And that's at adapacific.org. So we hope that you will also subscribe to our newsletter using the link on the left, which is adapacific.org/subscribe. We send out, we don't spam your mailbox, but we send out a lot of really good, important information. We do have a monthly newsletter that we send out that I think has a lot of information that you will find useful. Okay.
And Makai was asking, we have 2 minutes, so I think we can get to their question. Does anyone have a link for an ADA request template for the public?
Makai, I'm wondering if you mean, like if you're trying to contact an ADA coordinator, for example, is that what you're looking for?
Well, for some individuals who have writing difficulties and may not know what language to use, having a template that can help guide or frame their complaint or concern, I found to be helpful. So just asking if there's that material.
I'm not sure I've ever seen a template like that, but I know what you mean. You should never have to use magic words when you are actually asking for some sort of a modification or accommodation under the ADA. And anybody that is serving people or has obligations under the ADA should know that people should not have to use magic words, that they should understand. And if they need to clarify with somebody, they should absolutely do that to clarify what the person needs, but you should never have to use the words reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. I'm a person who meets the definition of disability. You should never have to use those words. And again, people that have obligations under the law, state or local governments, private businesses, private nonprofits should absolutely know that and should know to clarify that with anybody that they need to.
So on behalf of Jan and I know Jan has to go to another meeting, but I want to thank you all for your time today, and I hope this information was helpful. We will be sending out the copy of the PowerPoint and have the recording available shortly. And if your question wasn't answered, Presley is, rest assured, Presley is capturing the question and will be able to send out some answers when we send out the PowerPoint. And if we missed your question somehow, or you have a burning question, send us an email, either one of us, and we'll get back to you. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for coming. And yes, Makai, I sent you my direct email. All right. Have a good day.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, April and Presley.
Thanks, Jan.